All right, I'm going to make some English muffins today, but the first process I have to go through is proofing my yeast. So I've got some water here. It's sort of room temperature, body temperature, and I'm just going to add it to a large bowl. I've got some sugar. I just want to dissolve that a little bit in my water. And then I'm going to use dry active yeast. Now, dry active yeast always has to be proofed first in some water before we use it. You can't add it directly to your dry ingredients. The live cells of the dry yeast, the active dry yeast, are on the inside of these little balls, and the little balls are made up of dead cells. And so we have to dissolve those dead cells before we can get to the live active cells, and that's what will make our bread rise. So I'm going to just sprinkle these over my warm sugar water. And the reason I want to do this is so that it all dries evenly. I want to make sure that I don't have any clumps. I want it evenly distributed throughout my water, so all those live cells are reached at the same time. Now I want to cover this with some plastic wrap, or a damp towel will work as well. And depending on the temperature of your water, this can take about up to 10 minutes. And so we're just waiting for those cells to dissolve, those outer cells to dissolve, and the inner live cells to be activated. In the meantime, I've got some milk here and some melted shortening. I'm going to add my melted shortening to my milk, and I'm just going to warm this up slightly. And when my yeast is activated, then I'm ready to move on to my next step of mixing together my dough. So now my yeast has been activated. You can see the steam developing on the inside of my plastic wrap. That tells me my yeast is alive and it's breathing. And it's all foamy on top. That's what I'm looking for. Sometimes if you keep your yeast too long, it might not be active, and that means it's too old, or your water was too hot. So always make sure you get this nice foaminess before you start, otherwise your final product isn't going to work so well. So I just want to add this to my mixer. And I'm also going to add my warm milk and my shortening. And again, you don't want that too hot because you don't want to kill your yeast right away. And now I'm ready to add my dry ingredients to this. So again, I've got some all-purpose flour and some salt that I'm going to add. I want to add my flour. I'm going to add most of my flour, but not all of my flour. Different seasons, different humidities, you may not need all this flour, or you may need a little bit more flour too. So I just want to start with about 3/4 of my flour and save some of it for the end. I am going to add all my salt though. So I'm going to start with my paddle attachment to bring my dough together. So on low speed, I always like to give it just a few little turns at the beginning so my flour doesn't go flying up in the air. And it's coming together. It's a really soft, moist dough, so I see I need some more flour. So I'm going to add some more of my flour to this. And this is a really soft dough. If you ever notice inside a typical English muffin, it usually has lots of holes. That's because the dough is so wet and soft that those air bubbles can form around or inside the dough. So usually if your bread has lots of big holes in it, that's typically a really soft, moist dough. I'm going to put a little more flour in this. And some days you may even need a little bit more flour than this. So this is going to form into a ball. And then I'll be ready to switch to my dough hook, and I want to knead it for about 10 minutes, 6 to 10 minutes, until it's nice and soft and elastic. And you can do this by hand. It'll take a little bit longer for it to become elastic. Just scrape this off my paddle. I like to use my hands because I like how my dough feels. That gives me a chance to really feel if it's moist enough, if it has enough flour, if I get in there, and that just comes from experience making lots of dough. It's kind of messy, but I think that's part of the joy of bread making. Take all that off there. Switch to my dough hook. and let that go on low speed for 6 to 8 minutes. It'll be nice and soft and elastic, and then we'll be ready to let it proof. So my dough has all come together. It's kneaded for about 8-ish minutes. It's nice and smooth and elastic, exactly where I want it to be. It's quite a sticky dough, so I want to flour my surface that I'm going to be working on before I get started. So I've got just a little bit of all-purpose flour. I'm just going to sprinkle it on my counter just so it doesn't get stuck. Take out my dough onto my floured surface, and I like to knead it a little bit by hand just so I make sure it's where I want it to be. I like to feel it a little bit. So I just want to fold it over and stretch it and push it down with the heel of my hand. So it's a stretch and fold and push it down, form it into a nice bowl or a nice ball. Bring it all together in the center. And there, it's a really nice soft dough, exactly where I want it to be. Now I need it to ferment. So I've got a large bowl, larger than the size of my dough ball, a little bit of canola oil just so that my dough doesn't stick to my bowl. I like to spread it around with my hands on my bowl. Wipe my hands on my dough so my dough doesn't dry out. And just plunk it in there. And then I'm going to cover it with some plastic. And a damp cloth works as well. And I always like to make note of the time that I'm covering it so I know how long it's been fermenting for. So just with a Sharpie or a marker, I just write the time, 3 o'clock. And that way I know how long it's been there for. I can keep track of it a little bit better. And you just want to put it in a corner of your kitchen, nothing too hot, nothing too cold, and just leave it until it's doubled in size. It should take 30 minutes to an hour and a half. All right, now I'm ready to cut my English muffins. So the first thing I want to do is prepare my baking sheet. So I've got a parchment-lined baking sheet. I just want to sprinkle some cornmeal on my parchment, just so that they don't stick, and it adds a little color and a little crunch to my English muffins. So they're just going to sort of sit on top of this. Just want to scatter that around, and then I'm going to put this off to the side. Now I've got my fermented dough. It's doubled in size, and it's quite soft and sticky. So I want to put down a layer of flour on my work surface first so that it doesn't stick, so it's a little bit easier to work with. And just gently put my dough onto my work surface. I do want to be gentle at this point. I don't want to lose too much of that gas that's developed on the inside of my dough. I'm going to sprinkle it with a little bit more flour so it's easier to work with. And I just want to press it down gently. And I want to roll it out to about a 1/2 inch thickness. So before I roll it, I want to put a little bit of flour on it. And just gently roll it. I don't want to push too hard. I don't want to lose any of that structure that's developed in my dough. So that seems like about a 1/2 inch thick to me. I've got a 3.5 inch cutter. You can make them any size you'd like them to be. Ideally, you want to make them all about the same size though. And just cut them out and transfer them to your prepared baking sheet. You can re-roll the dough once. I wouldn't do it more than once, so all your scraps of dough, you can re-roll it into a couple extra English muffins. All right, I'm just going to cut one more and put it on my tray. When my tray is filled, then I want to loosely cover them with plastic, or a tea towel will work as well. Just loosely so they can rise. I want to let them sit for about a 1/2 hour, and then I'll be ready to cook them. My English muffins have finished proofing, and now I'm ready to cook them in a non-stick pan. I've got my non-stick pan about medium-low heat. I'm going to take off my plastic. And I don't want to overload my pan. I'll just put a couple of them into my pan really gently. I'm just tossing the second side in cornmeal as well so that I have cornmeal on both sides. So as many as my pan will hold. And I just want to cook them on one side. It does take a little bit of time because they do have to cook all the way through, 4 to 5 minutes per side. All right, so my English muffins are now cooked all the way through. They're nice and golden brown. So I'm ready to take them out of my pan and just put them on my cooling rack, or you can serve them nice and hot at this time. You can let them cool them completely on your cooling rack, and you can wrap them up and freeze them and keep them in your freezer for, gosh, about 6 weeks, and they'll still be nice and fresh. Slice them and toast them when you're ready to use them if you're using frozen or day-old English muffins. And that's really all there is to it. Visit ATCOBlueflamekitchen.com for more tips.